Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. Good evening, everybody. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the introduction, because it's something that I'm not, which is an historian. So it's kind of quite interesting to be here in the august surrounds of the School of History, where I've only ever sat in the past and interviewed people for academic positions, and to be giving a talk. So I say that because not being an historian and not being someone who's worked on the First World War, you might wonder why I'm here at all. And there's a good reason for that. It goes back really to when I first came to the university 14 or 15 years ago, and I heard the bare bones of the story, the case study that's at the heart of my talk tonight, which was about one of my predecessors. In fact, it was about the founding chair of German, going back to 1890, a man by the name of Albert Wilhelm Schudderkopf. You can see him there. I put this on because it amused me. This is when the Yorkshire College of Science had just become the Yorkshire College, and clearly they were saving in true Yorkshire fashion on the stationery, and they've struck it out. So this is 1890. One of the oldest chairs in German language and literature. The story I heard at the time was that he was very, very shabbily treated by the university, and in fact I was told that he was interned on the Isle of Man for being German, neither of which have proven to be true. And I've been looking for an excuse really to delve into this history for the last 10 or 15 years, and the Legacies of War project and the exhibition in particular that ran last year about the university during the First World War provided me with an opportunity. So what I'm going to basically do is start off by sketching some detail around the German community in Great Britain at the outset of the First World War, and I'm going to show how, in actual fact, contrary to some of the standard views, that attitudes on the eve of the First World War to Germans were actually in the main quite positive. And I'm going to talk in particular about the impact of the German university system on the British university system. I'll then go through and ask, or kind of try and answer questions I was asking myself, namely what happened after the outbreak of war to change attitudes towards the German community, and how this played out in the case of my illustrious predecessor. And one thing I did discover, which gave me kind of the motivation to do the project at all, was that in the Brotherton Library there's an absolutely wonderful collection of materials, because this man became something of a cause célèbre and sort of hit the national headlines at the time. Okay, so that's roughly what I shall be doing. It's kind of an illustrated talk, really. I've recently just sent off a fuller account of this to a German publisher, but I'm going to kind of try and talk you through it in a relatively informal way. So I think one of the striking aspects, for me at least, of the commemoration last year of the 100th anniversary of the war was the amid the flurry of documentaries, 2,500 hours of new BBC documentaries, of new books, commemorative events and the like, was the degree of attention that was paid to the home front. And projects like Legacies of War have played a part there, as have the AHRC engagement centres and the like. And it struck me that barely a day went by without some nugget of information coming out about life in Leeds or life in Skipton, where I happen to live, relating to the actual events of the First World War. Perhaps slightly unsurprisingly, there was less attention in all of that coverage to events which put Britons in a slightly less than positive light. And perhaps that was no more so the case than in relation to how Britons went about their daily affairs with the German minority living in the UK. And I think at the time that we live in at the moment, where the word migrant in some quarters is something of a swear word or a curse, where attitudes to immigrants can be coloured by some of the larger conflicts that are going on in the world, it's not difficult to imagine what life might have been like for those people living in the UK from 1914 to 1918, who through no fault of their own found themselves, on account of their heritage, caught up in the crossfire of world events. Now, my particular interest, I think, also in terms of the present time is that attention really since last year has shifted a little bit, hasn't it, from the First World War to commemorating the momentous events of 1945. We've had lots of 70th anniversaries, haven't we? Whether it be the liberation of Auschwitz, the atom bomb, etc., the end of the war. And I think there is perhaps a missed opportunity for us to focus some of the attention on, as I say, some of the less positive chapters in British history through the First World War, particularly in connection to immigrant minorities. I say this actually as someone who's got Austrian heritage himself. So when I heard about our friend Shudikoff initially, there was a personal motivation and interest there. And I'd like to kind of get stuck in to my talk by saying a little bit about Germans in 1940 in the German community. It was surprisingly large. Something in the 1911 census says 60,000, there or thereabouts. It's the third largest community of immigrants in the UK, after the Irish community and the community of Jewish heritage. Germans are present in all walks of life. There's something like 10,000 of them who are naturalised Britons, who are British citizens. Many working in engineering and in commerce, and also in academic life, but the bulk of the German... Do come in.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll just take a seat. Sorry. The bulk of the German minority are actually working in what we might today call service professions, service industry, service jobs. So, for example, as butchers, as bakers, as beer brewers, as hairdressers, as waitresses and waiters. And as a consequence, they were kind of very much a visible presence on just about every high street in the country. And they were often regarded really quite fondly. The phrase, our German cousins, was one which was bandied about quite freely. And of course this extended not just to your ordinary Johanns and Josephinas on the high street, but also to our royal family. Now, I don't know if you recognise the rather fetching young figure in Scottish outfit, but that is the man who became Kaiser Wilhelm II, pictured as a young boy at Balmoral Castle. And quite literally, German cousins, to use that phrase, they were also members of the royal family. Here you see the Kaiser with his mother Victoria, who's the daughter of Queen Victoria, and this kind of general openness to Germans was quite a feature, notwithstanding the so-called Anglo-German antagonism that starts from the early 1900s, as there's a proliferation of competition, between Germany and Britain as military powers. Now, one thing I discovered when asking myself, well, what was it like to be a German academic, because that's the focus of my case study tonight, was that I realised to a greater degree than I've been aware of before that the German university system in many ways acted as a kind of blueprint for our own, that it had a great deal of influence on the development of the British university system, not least because of the prevalence of German academics working in that system. And I'd just like to go on and say a few more words about that. Germany, let's take a point in 1900. Germany had a much more advanced university education system than Great Britain. This was on account of complex reforms that had taken place in the early 19th century, but also there was a recognition of government money going in to fund higher education, and we might say from a 21st century perspective, in the recognition that an educated workforce was very good for the general well-being of the country. Now, Britain's cast a kind of, I wouldn't say an envious eye on the German university system, but actually an admiring one. And there was quite a lot of traffic to and fro. Many young Britons, many future academics would go and kneel at the feet of their illustrious teachers at the University of Göttingen and the like. Goes way back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was credited with starting a bit of a craze. He goes and spends time reading about German culture and studying German culture in the 1790s. And one of the great sort of advocates of the German system, who we'll see gets quite shabbily treated later, was Haldane. Haldane will be known certainly to any military historians in the room as war secretary who undertook a lot of reforms in the early century. Haldane had studied German philosophy in Göttingen, and he was this passionate advocate for the German system. And here we have, just as an example of this, a speech that he gave to a Chamber of Commerce in Liverpool in 1902 on the function of a university in a commercial city. And the bit that I draw your attention to is down here, where he's basically saying, why should not Liverpool and Manchester, with their public spirit and rapidly increasing populations, possess, as in Germany, they certainly would, their own universities? How ridiculous it is to dread that such universities would prove Lilliputian. Why should Leeds not be the headquarters of a Yorkshire university? This is 1902. This is around the time where the Yorkshire College, previously Yorkshire College of Science, becomes University College of the University of Manchester, and we have the red brick universities set up. And these new red brick universities, in many ways, were taking their kind of steer in terms of the type of universities they might be from the German system through the exhortations of people like Haldane. So let me just turn now to our friend the Professor Schudikoff. Just a few things about what he was up to around this time. He organises holiday courses for sort of the extension lecture movement. Here we have Schudikoff will lecture on Goethe's Wilhelm Meister and the like. He is one of the people who is proposing honorary degrees on the eve of war to leading industrialists from Germany. You've got here Adolf Greiner, Friedrich Springhorn. These are presidents of the Society of German Ironmasters. For a university like Leeds, for a city like Leeds, Bradford perhaps all the more so, that's doing an awful lot of trade with Germany, fostering good relations, having these people represented, receiving honours, was something that was very significant. And my illustrious predecessor was also quite significant. I've referred to him somewhere as the inventor of this study abroad year, which is probably a bit of an extravagant claim, but he was someone who, as was typical in Germany, you would study at several universities. He knew the benefits of studying abroad, and Schudikoff proposed that university students at Leeds should be able to take as part of their study a period of time abroad, initially for modern languages students, which was a massive innovation at the time. So I need to just pause there. That's come up a little bit quick, but we'll leave it. So here's a man, he becomes Dean of the Faculty of Arts. He's involved in all the sort of things. He's involved in the Leeds Arts Club, which is a major fulcrum for intellectual debate in the city. And he finds himself, on the outbreak of war, very badly conflicted. And I'd like to kind of take as the next part of my lecture just a little tour through some of those significant events during the course of the war that impacted on what I've been contending was a generally positive view of Germans in this country. The first one, right at the start of the war, was the trail of atrocities that the invading German armies left in neutral Belgium. The whole kind of military strategy behind the invasion of Belgium was for a very rapid victory, and without any doubt, as subsequent scholarship has shown, there was a number of war crimes were committed there, and these were picked up and taken and reported in the press in quite typical kind of fashion, you might say. So there were scenes of devastation, the looting of churches, rape, pillaging, killing civilians. And one of the events that actually was key, which was regarded as kind of a crime against civilization, was the so-called sack of Louvain, the destruction of the medieval library at the University of Louvain. The sack, it was kind of reminiscent, so it was said, of the sack of Rome. And here we have, as reported in The Guardian, a statement against this unutterable crime that took place. And it's a statement from the then Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds, on behalf of the University of Leeds, Sir Michael Sadler, who's expressing his outrage. He's commiserating with the poor people who've been so wantonly attacked. And I thought that, in terms of what I'll be telling you later in my talk, it's quite interesting to see that Sadler, at least, is able to differentiate between these barbaric acts by some Germans amongst the German armed forces and the ordinary German people. He talks about the human Germans, the lovers of learning and science, whom we have respected and shall continue to respect. So this hasn't been perpetrated by them, but by the downright victims, by downright barbarians, the brood of ruthless war. So the stories of the atrocities in Belgium get brought back to Britain, not least, and this was a phenomenon that was new to me, by a vast, hitherto unprecedented influx of refugees. And again, I think there's something kind of quite of some modern resonance in this. Approximately 250,000 Belgian refugees come to Britain. The first arrive in September. The largest influx that there's actually ever been. If you think that Great Britain has said that it will admit 17,000 refugees over the next 5 years from Syria, that gives you an idea of the enormity of this movement of people. There were help committees set up in Leeds, for example, in the university and the like. Of course, the Belgian refugees, who are placed all over the country, bring with them tales of the atrocities, which in the popular imagination and in the popular propaganda inevitably get somewhat distorted. For all that there were very real atrocities that took place. And we see how these events play into the wartime propaganda. Now, at the time, Britain has got a voluntary army, so it's quite clear that propaganda was required, or people needed to be motivated to enlist to the colours, and propaganda played its part there. We get the rape of Belgium. Will you stand for this, men of England? And the Belgian events really were the first to arouse ill will and anti-German sentiment. You had the very first riot took place in Keighley in August of 1914, and some of the sentiment took quite bizarre manifestations. This one I've put up for you. That things like the poor German dachshund, not only does it get renamed the sausage dog, but it gets instrumentalised in cartoons and caricatures to personify Germany. Here we've got the British bulldog eating up. There are accounts of dachshunds being stoned on the street. I'm told these are apocryphal by people who know much more about these things than I do, but at least Graham Greene recorded one such event in his autobiography. And you kind of get the playing out of animal stereotypes in some of the propaganda. And just to illustrate this, for a little bit of levity, this is taken from the Tatler in 1914. I've just kind of done a snapshot of what is a much longer little ditty, but we have the dachshunds being gobbled up by the German bulls. So if Belgium played into growing anti-German sentiment, then the attacks on Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby just before Christmas 1914 had quite a significant effect. Why? Well, this was the first time really since England used to fight the Scots that there had been civilian casualties on British soil. The attacks took place just after breakfast as people were going about the daily business. You can see the casualty figures there, of whom there were some children, and this caused a great panic, really, in the whole region. The Leeds Rifle Regiment is shipped out to Scarborough and marches through the street as a show of solidarity. People start packing their bags and fleeing Scarborough, and this was, I think, in a deft bit of political rhetoric, was linked by Winston Churchill, who's the first Sea Lord at the time in the Admiralty. Not entirely blameless in terms of how did 4 or 5 German cruisers manage to slip through British sea defences and perpetrate this particular act. He likens the German Navy to the baby killers of Belgium. This was one of the bits of the rhetoric. This was published in the Times as an open letter. But really very, very significant effect. And again, you have the principle of things coming in to the propaganda. The actual destruction was much more severe in Hartlepool, but I'm guessing that because Scarborough was a household name, it becomes Remember Scarborough. Enlist now. Remember, conscription doesn't come in until 1916, and this is another motivation to avenge Scarborough. Okay. Other acts by the German forces, which were seen to be contrary to the spirit of law and international law, came with the Zeppelin attacks. So Scarborough's December, January, the first attacks on the East Coast. Some bombs fall on Hull, if we look from a Yorkshire context. But again, civilians becoming potential targets. At the same time, there's news coming back of poor treatment of British soldiers as prisoners of war. There's news coming in from the colonies, from German Southwest Africa, of the heinous Germans poisoning wells, and poisoning the water supply. These filter through. And perhaps one of the most significant events was the use of poison gas, chlorine gas, at the Second Battle of Ypres. And the commander of the British Armed Forces talks about this being a cynical and barbarous disregard of the well-known usages of civilised war. So it would appear that the Germans were just not playing by the normal rules of warfare. And this perhaps reaches comes to its climax with the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1925. Clearly this is a really major event. Why? Well, the Lusitania, remember it's only 3 years after the Titanic went down. Lusitania is at this time, with the Mauritania, its sister ship, the most famous luxury passenger steamer in the world. It set the blue ribbon for speeding across the Atlantic. And it sunk off the coast of Ireland by a German torpedo. Germany had declared open sea warfare in a zone around the British Isles, and you see the headline there from the New York Times. It sinks in 18 minutes. People have very little chance to get out, and there you have the death toll, which is very significant indeed. Over nearly 1,200 people, 94 children, and of the 39 babies aboard, 35 perished, mostly in the third class on the lower decks, as you can imagine. And as you all know, you don't need me to tell you, this was quite significant later in encouraging the US to come in to enter the war, not least because there was a high proportion of the US citizens on board who perished. So this was kind of like Britain was facing an enemy that would literally stop at nothing, not even at the murder of children. And there's quite a lot of work that's been done around the whole cultural history of the sinking of the Lusitania that looks at the role that the death of the children play in this particular event. In Germany, the responses, as a book that's just been published earlier this year shows, were actually on the whole, quite kind of celebratory. Thomas Mann, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1908, talks in his Reflections of an Unpolitical Man, Betrachtung eines Unpolitischen, about the destruction of the symbol of English maritime supremacy. And he's talking about this kind of comfortable, the suggestion is that it's a symbol of decadence, of this Riesenlustschiff, this gigantic pleasure steamer, the Lusitania. If we contrast that with, and of course this was reported, the U-boat captain who sinks the Lusitania gets pour le mérite from the emperor. This causes another wave of kind of outrage across the world. This is a major international event, and there was mention at the beginning that we're looking at some of the intellectual currents here. I found this in a report in the Times, and this is from the coroner, the Irish coroner, Mr. Rice, who talks about this being a kind of a wound to it's wounded the hearts of millions, it shocked the universal Christian conscience, etc., etc. It's atrocious, it's nefarious. But I thought it's kind of quite interesting that blame is also laid at the German sort of way of viewing the world philosophically, when there's talk of, quote, a deplorable system of philosophy, teaching that's permeated our own universities, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later. It's false, pernicious, materialistic, unchristian. So there's a sense that there's something rotten in the state of German culture. Okay. So that's basically a very quick kind of tour of how events in the first year of the war start to play out on views of Germany and Germans in Britain. And this comes to a head with the so-called Lusitania Riots. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking and the reporting of it, we have riots that are triggered in the Lusitania's home port of Liverpool. There's wild, vicious rioting that takes place there, which pretty much spreads all around the country. And it's said that this is probably still the biggest kind of wave of rioting ever to have taken place in Britain, certainly in the 19th and the 20th century. So things get ratcheted up all the more here, and you get, of course, the popular conservative press wading in. Horatio Bottomley and John Bull, this mass circulation weekly magazine, demands a vendetta against every German in Britain, whether naturalised or not. You cannot naturalise an unnatural beast, the human abortion, the hellish freak, but you can exterminate it. A week later, in the same magazine, he demands that all Germans, naturalised or not, should be shipped off to concentration camps. So this is just how kind of frenzied and volatile the situation is. And it becomes a campaign not just against Germans who are here as immigrants, but also against the naturalised Germans. There's about 8,000 Germans who are naturalised, who are being required to make statements of loyalty, and you get some of the accounts at the time. These are from Manchester. The Manchester Guardian reports in the wake of the rioting, which lasts about 6 or 7 days, needs the troops to quell the unrest, that Germans are actually coming forward in their hundreds and thousands, asking to be taken into custody for their own safekeeping, so much so that the police authorities cannot cope. Now, let's come back to Haldane. So people who were pro-German, or seem to be pro-German, I'm interested in the impact on people in public life, of the growing anti-German sentiment. And one or two examples, familiar one is Louis von Battenberg, who was first Sea Lord, took over from Churchill. He changes his name to Mountbatten very quickly and resigns from office. And our friend Haldane, who was regarded as, one of the, known to be a lover of German philosophy, is effectively forced out of office. And here we have a New York Times. I take the New York Times because in the hope that it gives us a slightly distanced and perhaps more nuanced view of things. And he who has done so much, he who was actually, as is reported here, was responsible for Kitchener becoming War Secretary, is forced through because he's got a German mind. Now, Lord Haldane was to come back, a Liberal who becomes a Labour politician and is restored to office, I think, in 1924. Battenberg and other prominent people had their connections. So I kind of asked myself, what was it like for people who were in public life, who had a role, but didn't have the protection of prominent friends? And this takes us really to our academics. First one I'm going to refer to is a man called Hermann Ethé. Here he is. He was obviously sufficiently well known for there to be a cartoon of him as well. He is an Orientalist and Germanist. Now, in the 19th century, early 20th century, Britain, by dint of the fact that it had its colonies, was an absolute paradise for Orientalists. We had, probably still do, wonderful collections, museums and the like. And this guy, Hermann Ethé, takes up a position at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. And under papers that have recently been released by the National Library of Wales, we have his case documented. And basically he was someone who, at the very outset of the war, was forced out of town. And the papers and the newspaper accounts of the time talk about there being a public meeting, alcohol is taken in significant amounts, two local town councillors whip up the crowd into a fury, they march to Ethé's house, he's at the university, his wife's there on her own, she's terrorised, and they're forced to pack their bags up and leave, never to return, leaving behind all his priceless papers and the like. Paul tells me, Paul Cook tells me that there is actually a plaque to commemorate this event there.
And significantly after this event?
Yes, significantly afterwards. Now, this takes me to our German professor here in Leeds, and I'm going to spend the remainder of my talk actually narrating how he became this cause célèbre. This is a letter from October 1914, and it relates to his son. Excuse me, I'll just take a sip of water. So Schuderkopf, Albert Wilhelm Schuderkopf, is a naturalised Briton. That's relevant for later on, as is what I was just saying about this kind of campaign against naturalised Germans. He's naturalised 1912. The son was born in Leeds in 1890, just after he takes up his position here. Studies at Cambridge. He's a member of the OTC at Cambridge. And in July 1914, just before war breaks out, he's invited to apply for a commission in the 7th Battalion of the Leeds Rifles, which he accepts. But there are concerns about his German name that are articulated, but particularly after the professor goes round, as is documented in this letter, to meet his commanding officer and says, look, send him anywhere, please. Anywhere but the Western Front. I don't want him to be put in a position where he might conceivably be shooting at his relatives. Yeah? Which, you know, as a father, is a sentiment I think one can relate to. Whether it was necessarily an ill-judged or a well-judged intervention, given what happens later, we'd probably say perhaps wasn't so well-judged, and certainly the Vice-Chancellor of the day said, well, you might have been better just getting him to resign this commission and everything would have been quiet, but he doesn't. And I asked myself, well, yeah, to what extent was this a realistic fear? So I did a little trawl through German databases because of course you can do all of this digitally these days, can't you, of war dead. And Schuderkopf, for the Germanists who've turned out in mass, nice to see you colleagues this evening, they will know that with its, we take the name, with its combination of a low German double D and a high German PF, okay, those consonant sounds, it's actually strange. It's kind of an unusual name. It's not a very common name at all. So if you do a trawl for the name, there's a likelihood of those, a cluster of Schuderkopfs that I found who died in the First World War from the Göttingen area, that they were very likely, I can't prove it, but they're very likely related in some way or other. So the commanding officer thinks this is fine. Yeah? It's all right, we'll sort it out. But news leaks, and this becomes really the cause of a kind of whispering campaign that takes place. And it comes to a head particularly after another external event plays in, and this is the death of Lord Kitchener on his way east on the Hampshire. His ship is sunk, he perishes, he's a national hero, and there's all talk of must be German spies living in England. So you've got this absolute spy fever, which was there before the war. There'd been a whole load of invasion novels, there'd been sort of reports of spies in August 1914. There are something like 50,000 reports to the police that a spy here and a spy here. No known prosecutions took place. So in this fevered atmosphere, someone who's kind of locally kind of got himself noticed is likely to find himself in the crossfire of other discussions. And remember what I said just a few moments ago about the discussion around the naturalised Germans, of one of which Schutterkopf is. Arthur Wing Pinero, a well-known playwright, writes to the Times after the sinking of the Lusitania, to the extent that it's about time these naturalised Britons actually made a statement, that they came out and pledged their loyalty. Yeah? And here we have one such letter. This is dated 13th of May. 7th of May is the sinking of the Lusitania. This is after a week of rioting. And we get 5 Germanists from various universities listed who talk in light of recent events. They express their unswerving loyalty to the country of our adoption, to which we feel bound not only by gratitude, family ties and our solemn oath of allegiance, which they swore on being naturalised, but also by deep sympathy born of common work and intimate knowledge of the nation's life and character. These people, all in their own way, working in universities, were kind of intermediaries of the German culture. Schutterkopf himself used to publish monthly kind of reviews of the latest English literature in German press and the like. And so we get this public statement. And this statement actually is what brings international attention. It's in the Times. It's noticed also by German newspapers. I'm still tracking the sources. I found a reference from a local journalist who's asking whether the university has any copies of German newspapers, but there's reports of these guys being held up as traitors for doing this on the other side of the fence. But it becomes this kind of cause célèbre, and for the first time in this wealth of documents that we've got in the Brotherton, there's mention of the Schutterkopf case. And what we have in the documents is essentially all sorts of correspondence, particularly between Michael Ernest Sadler, MES at the bottom, and his the Home Secretary, etc., etc. So here we've got, and this is, I've put this up because this is just one of the very many spurious, gossipy claims that were made against him. That the bête noire is a guy called Alderman Wilson, who's chairman of the Finance Committee of Leeds City Council. He was also a person who was very significant in raising the Leeds Pals battalion, and he has got it in for Schutterkopf in rather a major way. So he's been found introducing a volume of Nietzsche's works with the university label on it and a bottle of whiskey, which was confiscated. Have we missed a volume of Nietzsche? So Michael Sadler's asked about this, and there's another document that shows that has the librarian checked whether a book had been taken out of the library. Now, why Nietzsche? We've heard, haven't we, the coroner's report about this kind of bestial German culture. There's something rotten in the materialism and anti-Christianity of German philosophy. And at the time, in the British propaganda, particularly in a series of publications known as the Oxford Pamphlets, people like Nietzsche, Hegel as well, but Nietzsche in particular, who in the vernacular was known as Nietzsche, was held up as the spiritual father of all that was terrible about German culture. And what's kind of ironic is at the very same time, in Leeds, there's a salon, an intellectual salon called the Leeds Arts Club that I mentioned at the very outset of my talk, whose sort of express manifesto is, quote unquote, to reduce Leeds to Nietzscheanism. So you have George Bernard Shaw of Man and Superman fame comes up and gives talks in a great hall chaired by Michael Sadler about Nietzsche. The founder of the Leeds Arts Club, a man called Orage, has a very influential modernist literary journal called The New Age, and over a few years they published something like 80 or 90 articles on Nietzsche. So if you took Nietzsche around, you were somehow being disloyal and spreading sedition and opposition to the crown. We have then what happens? Well, Sir John Simon is Home Secretary. Sadler is quite a bigwig in Edwardian Britain. He is someone who knows his way around the corridors of power, and he makes a personal visit to the Home Secretary to get him to intervene to prevent what is likely to be the internment of his colleague. And we have the Home Secretary acceding to the suggestion that they go to Harrogate. Yeah? And it's at this point in the documents we get mention of the nervous distress, the stress, the pressure, the lack of sleep that Shuttlecock and his wife are encountering because of the kind of campaign against him. And a restricting order is placed on him, which means he has to leave Leeds. He can have no contact with members of the armed forces, which effectively means he can't teach students who are in the reserve or meet with colleagues who are also in the reserve, and it's effectively kind of a restriction on his ability to do his job. Things trickle on, and come the autumn of 1915, I think this is kind of quite significant, is that the authorities are so outraged that a leave of absence has been granted to the Professor of German on a 3/4 salary, nota bene, that it threatens and then does withhold the grant that the city gives to the university. Now, I've gone through the year-end reports and everything. The income of the university in 1915 is £60,000. It's about £600,000 now. And 1/12 of that was made up by the grant from the local authority. And there's this massive standoff, and the university sees this as a really shameless attempt to intervene in its autonomous affairs, and resists and resists and resists until it can resist no more, and that is because the pressure builds up on Shuttlecock. Michael Sadler talks about it being near explosion, and he's prevailed upon to leave his job, but before he can, he dies of after a short illness of nervous exhaustion around September 1916. And here you have the Senate of the university passes its resolution talking about the distress and mental strain of the war brought on one who had striven for mutual understanding between Germany and Great Britain, and whose most cherished hopes were shattered by a catastrophe which, insofar as in him lay, he'd endeavoured to avoid. So that is in effect, the story that I set out to kind of find a little bit more about. It's reported in the Times again. There's the whole thing about the conflict of European civilization is alluded to, and that's kind of the end of my talk, really. So I'll finish there. I'm conscious of the time, and we're happy to take any questions or thoughts or observations that you might have, but thank you for being so attentive. And it's become dark, hasn't it? We might actually put some lights on.
Yeah, many thanks indeed for that really fascinating, interesting paper, Professor Finlay, with some quite personal connections, personal regional connections, which were very significant, I think you'll all agree. So I'd like to open the floor up now to questions, if anybody's got one. I'm sure there are lots of...
Could it happen now? Could it happen now? I think that's maybe one of the more interesting kind of things to reflect on, isn't it? Could it happen now? I think it certainly is a cautionary tale, isn't it? I think it shows. I mean, what's interesting to me about it is it gets beyond this kind of black and white that the Germans were beastly and the British were beastly to the German community living in Britain. That certainly did take place, and that is, if anything, is like the established narrative. Quite a lot of work has been done about anti-German sentiment. There's a lot of work being done about the anti-German propaganda and the like. But here you have a case of a university, actually, and there's lots of talk about defending his rights as a member of the Senate, doing its utmost to withstand really what was quite a poisonous local campaign. There were other references in the documentation to the alderman saying he will take this man down. And why? Something I didn't mention was there's rumour and gossip. His wife, for example, was heard to say at Scarborough, where they were taking the waters in September 14, that she didn't believe all the stories about the atrocities. In particular, a story that was circulating, a notorious story about children having their hands cut off. Yeah, and she was heard to say this, and it's how rumour and gossip can ferment. But of course, it's kind of, I suppose, there's an interesting element about the autonomy of universities as well, and the power of the purse. But the university did withstand that. But it got to the point, 1916, where Sadler thinks it's no longer a tenable position. It's after the Battle of the Somme, and the Leeds Pals Regiment, of whom we've heard already, of the 900 who do battle on the Somme, 750 are killed in the first hour. The mass carnage that took place, and those stories come back, and there's just this kind of general sentiment. I mean, one should be careful of drawing to kind of lazy comparisons with the present day, but one imagines what is it like if you're in the wrong time, in the wrong place, on account of your heritage, in a country that's at war with your own. And what's interesting, this is a naturalised Britain as well, and the quote from Bottomley is not just anti-German. It's actually talking about an essential Germanness that is incredibly racist views there. Could it happen? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking more along the lines of radicalised Islam, the social institutions, by popular press, these are kind of liberal institutions that poetic kind of, the pressure that's put on institutions to keep an eye on, or keep a lid on, or crack down on things that the outside world might consider extreme. And this is a kind of not that long since paediatricians were being attacked by people who mistook them for paedophiles. The kind of mob reaction to highly tense situations is probably underestimated.
And it's I think there's the discourse of it as well in the newspaper and other media. And what was significant, I guess, about the First World War is that for the first time, really, you've got kind of a mass propaganda machine, which in Britain is generally regarded to have been sophisticated. Is probably the wrong word. But more extensive than the German propaganda machine, precisely because I think there was this need to mobilise the home front, to offer up soldiers to fight on the actual front. Paul.
What happened to the other signatures for the letter? Is there a specific Leeds flavour to the way this guy was persecuted, or was it kind of for all of them treated?
No, Wichmann at Birmingham was handed out. With the active complicity of the University of Birmingham, so they don't come out of it very well. As I said in my introduction, the story I heard was that Leeds doesn't come out of this very well, but I think by comparison we come out pretty well indeed. The guy at Oxford had been tutor to George V, taught him German, so he was okay. He had some local protection there. There appear to have been kind of different local things going on. What was very significant here was that a number of people just saw it as their mission to, quote, take this person down, because they thought it was an outrage that he should be allowed to be in place. And what's interesting as well is that because of kind of name association, it extends also to people of Jewish heritage. So it's not just Germans. And there's a link on one of my slides. I was looking at some footage of the coverage of the Lusitania Riots, and the British Film Institute has got some really interesting documentary footage there. One of which is on the first anniversary of the sinking of the Lusitania, and there's the British Union has this march, and they're parading a model of the Lusitania through the streets, and it's sort of imprison all Germans, hang Germans, all this sort of stuff. And then you've got other ethnic minorities marching along, kind of almost to prove, this is my interpretation, to prove that they're not Germans. So there's the Czechs for Britain and the like. Clearly, they're different, but the Hungarians and the Austrians trying not to be tarred by the same British. But no, it wasn't just a Leeds phenomenon, but it did extend to not just people who were, as it were, in the professoriate, but people. There were a lot of Germans working in UK higher education at the time. When in my talk, I'd kind of skated over it a little bit, but Germany's higher education system is something like 2/3 as big as Britain. So you get this expansion of the red brick universities, 6 red brick universities set up in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and there's a shortage of labour. There's a shortage of academics to populate them. So Germany has this big kind of there's a big draw for Germans. Of course, the Germans are attracted to come to Britain because it's a more liberal state, actually, which is kind of one of the ironies of what happened afterwards.
I was just wondering if there's any fallout between relationships between the city and the university after the conflict.
Well, it's the case it's got a number of levels of complexity about it. It's kind of quite clear that Sir Michael Sadler pulled a fast one with the city to get the grant by saying it'll all be okay, where he had no intention of making Shudikov resign, and it was potentially damaging, not least because of course the university had contributed massively to the war effort, and I think it's perhaps a measure of the stand that they were willing to take, that they were willing to jeopardise some of the good relations. But it's all kind of quite incestuous as well. You can imagine a city like Leeds. So a member of the University Council, Lupton, is also Lord Mayor, at this time, and indeed. So it's kind of, you've got these things, and then there's I'm trying to remember that there's a Leeds, one of the kind of big figures in Leeds at the time is also related by marriage to Lord Bryce, who publishes the reports just before the sinking of the Lusitania into the Belgian Atrocities. So there's kind of did it jeopardise longer term? I don't think it did, actually, because of course the university was quite staunch, and Sadler himself was happily writing letters of recommendation.
Sadler had a major row with the council over a municipal strike. So his relationships with the city, with the university, no good at all.
No.
When Sadler went back to Oxford, things calmed down.
Really? But didn't he, am I right in thinking he also urged students to break the strike?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, he's I think it's 1917, he's whisked off, seconded to India, and does a big report on Indian education. I mean, Sadler in many ways is the sort of one of the founding fathers of comparative education or comparative pedagogy. He's someone who did lots of studies of overseas universities, but a very independent figure who clearly was willing to court kind of unpopularity with the city. But when it was permanently damaged, I'm kind of not really answering your question. I'm not sure. It wouldn't appear to be. No. Graham.
Yes, fascinating talk. I wanted just to draw your attention to this Arthur Schuster, who was a German professor at Manchester University, who managed to avoid much of what you were talking about. received you of him. He was born in Frankfurt am Main, very a German Jew with his family in Manchester. Basically, what saved him in 1916 from a lot of Jewish office is that his brother and he and all his other brothers had all their sons in the British Army, all of them. And that seemed to make quite a decisive difference. And maybe also being the National University did not rely on the city training as much.
Well, yeah, I mean that's an interesting. But it would appear that the funding of the universities at the time, that they were all reliant on some money from the local councils, but at least to a greater extent. And you know, if I tell you it's a twelfth of the income that's being withheld, it's about £5,500. The fear would have been that other councils in West Yorkshire, who were also paying into the university, would likewise withhold the grant, and that's referred to. Yeah, but it was particularly acute here, which perhaps makes the stand all the more laudable, actually.
Okay.
Of course, we all want to know what happens to German studies at university. There's a lot of better.
Yeah, well, there was some work done in the late 20s, and then again after the Second World War, there was assessing the damage done to German studies, and it was very, very significant indeed. So in Leeds, the work continues, and there's a kind of skeleton, as it were, department that's running. But in terms of attitudes to Germany and the German language, it had a very deleterious effect. And of course, you might say that later on, that there was perhaps in the British elite, people like Haldane had been vilified, people who knew Germany and understood Germany and what was going on in Germany, that there might have been a certain deficit amongst the British sort of political elite in the 1920s and 30s, understanding what was happening through the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler. But in terms of foreign language study, it was just recovering by the early 30s, and then along comes the Second World War. So as a discipline, it's really post-45 that it's kind of starting from scratch.
Is there still one at the back? Or? Okay.
Your comments about the attitudes towards Haldane and Gothenburg and so on. I wonder whether things were somewhat different in the north, because of the technical expertise of Germany. So many prominent industrialists have spent some time in Germany getting the advantage of, for instance, chemical engineering and similar disciplines. And they don't, I think, as far as I can see, get the kind of backlash about their knowledge of Germany, having been educated partly in Germany, that some of the national figures do. So I wonder whether in the industrial areas who appreciate German technical expertise in its broader sense, that there is a slightly different view of British people, British fleet, who had some German education, German knowledge, often German relations, certainly German friends.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say with certainty. One thing I did encounter and discover was this, say on Wearside, Sunderland, but also here in the local textile industry in Bradford, the unions mobilise and demand of the employers to sack any members of the workforce of German heritage. So there's kind of a certain absence of working class solidarity that's taking place in certain industrial centres in the north of England. And I guess hereabouts, if we're looking at the academics, Birmingham, Sheffield was also, he was drummed out of office, never to return. Leeds and the like. So I'm not sure there was a regional differentiation, but you're talking about the attitudes to British
nationals, but British nationals who had a significant link with Germany. For example, in Huddersfield after the war, one of with prominent members of the committee which creates the civic memorial, was educated in Germany and has substantial German textile connections with the women trade.
Well, I guess after the war, some of those old contacts would have been required for business reasons, wouldn't they? Yeah. I've not answered your question, have I? I don't know, actually. But certainly there's at the time, during the war, it wasn't just if you were German, had a German-sounding name, yeah, but people who, there's documented occurrences of violence against people who'd been on holiday in Germany, yeah, who had any kind of form of German connections, who were British people. So it probably ebbed and flowed a little bit with the overall kind of level of hostility that might have been around.
Yes.
Is there any evidence that it's more aimed at academics, because they're perceived as not necessarily being as valuable, whereas people with engineering specialities that were needed with German names, so Charles Mertz, for example, didn't have any restrictions placed on him and was actually serving with the government and very publicly?
I think it's probably difficult to... I think the reality of it is that there were various different patterns, that there wasn't a kind of a one sort of experience that people shared. There were other ones of... I'm just trying to remember his name now. There's a Welsh industrialist who was significant in later being involved with IBM and the like, who was of German heritage, who was actually persecuted for that. So it may well say it's a bit haphazard. You can go to the Brotherton Library and look in the Little collection, and there's a file about not just Germanophobia but Germanophilia at the time as well. So it's not a kind of a clear-cut story. Maybe some of it was happenstance and local attitudes. In Bradford, for example, where I think I'm right in saying the Lord Mayor in 1910 was of German heritage. Of course, Bradford's got massive connections, not particularly with the colour industry, actually, with the dye industry with Germany. There would be a different kind of attitude perhaps there. So some of it was a little bit haphazard.
You just described explored this gradual escalation of anti-German sentiments in the first year of the war. Now I'm wondering who or what is driving that. So is it kind of a grassroots movement, trade unions, and trying to persuade the employers? Is it the media? Is it government propaganda? Or what is the network of the various...
Yeah, well, I guess it's probably all of those in different degrees. I think the actual... Some of it is word of mouth. So in relation to Belgium, presence of 250,000 Belgians with their stories will have been a significant factor. And of course, when you're hearing stories from the actual victims, they have almost greater credibility. But certainly the War Propaganda Bureau that was set up was very significant. And you had, and I'm probably generalising there, but you had a very compliant press, the Northcliffe newspapers, the Daily Mail, and I was kind of reminded, the photograph of the royal cousins is from the Daily Mail, which was from the edition that had the story about Queen Elizabeth doing the Nazi salute, that sort of thing. Yeah. But that's by the by. You might remember that from a few months ago. But certainly the mass circulation newspapers that had decided, they would say, a patriotic kind of approach that was there. But there were campaigns, and of course you could say equally that some of the acts of the German military in bombing defenceless coastal towns on the east coast and dropping bombs on citizens and poisoning wells and sinking passenger liners with massive loss of life, using the first use of this insidious weapon of mass destruction at Ypres, although the British went on to use it in September of the same year. A death that is akin to drowning, I'm told. The descriptions of that there was plenty to be taken and used to propagandistic aim. But I think news from the front is difficult. What was coming back there? The early part of the war, it appears to be quite remote, and there's significant news management. But certainly, if you look from end of 1415, the press coverage, and as I said earlier, with the online stuff that you can get the Times, and you don't just need to pick out what you see from your search that you've done, but look at the whole issue, and you get a very strong picture of just what the climate of the times. Of course, if I were in communication studies or discourse analysis, I'd probably say, well, you have to be careful that people don't necessarily believe everything and respond to everything that they read in newspapers. So there's a big health warning about that. But it certainly must have played in. And if you look at then, what are the effects? If you get mass rioting right across the country, it really was a nationwide phenomenon in the wake of the Lusitania sinking. Then that outrage has been transmitted somehow, hasn't it? That's not word of mouth. That's something where the media come into play. Local associations, I think that was more haphazard. You do have people like Sadler and others who are able to differentiate between those human Germans, and the ruthless brood of war. So there is that more nuanced thing.
Can I just ask, unlike the Manchester Islamic sacrifice, right, it seemed that having a son in the British Army wasn't enough to say
No.
What mischief was made of his intervention? Did they try and make out that he was shielded, trying to get his son shielded? And what happened to the son? And isn't there an interesting footnote?
Yes, there is. I did pay him a £5 to privately. The son knew nothing of the father's intervention, one. Two, at the same time, there's reports of trouble in the mess because of his name, so he would likely have come under pressure because of this, very German-sounding name. What happens afterwards? So it wasn't sufficient. He's born in Britain. He's had this commission. He's invited to join. That is insufficient. But also later on, he's one of thousands of Germans who then anglicise the name. So Saxe-Coburg Gotha, the royal family, become Windsor at the time. We've heard about Mountbatten. But Schudikoff becomes the last document, as I've written elsewhere in this big file that we've got here, is someone's noting that the son has changed his name to Shuttleworth. What happens? He becomes a medical practitioner and dies in 1960. And that's kind of what we know about. The pub names. You go around here, if you look at all the Brunswick. Have you ever noticed how many Brunswick places there are in this country? This was Braunschweig in the Kingdom of Hanover, where our kings came from. One of the most common pub names before the First World War was the Blücher, because Blücher was the Prussian saviour at the Battle of Waterloo. So it went right across kind of society, really, from the royal family through to this anglicisation that was very common at the time.
Any other questions? No? Okay. In that case, I'd like to conclude by saying thank you very much once again for taking time out of what must be a very, very busy schedule, and also for providing us, of course, with a really, really fascinating paper this evening to kick off this first semester. So thank you very much.